What do you mean there's no new episode this week? Well, time to improvise. What do you think about this year's season of My Hero Academia thus far? Let me know in the comment section down below and I'll get back to you shortly. Whilst you're there, be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do, because YouTube is an increasingly scary place for small content creators. Support your local small content creator today, it will do them a power of good. Now onto the review. I will be doing a full review of the season as a whole once it concludes, so this is just kind of my thoughts at the moment. Things may change as I look back on it. So we'll start off with the first arc, the joint training arc. Now, this is one that for some is a bit of a controversial one in the eyes of some fans. Not due to the content they're in, but seemingly because of the lack thereof. Or at least how long the arc itself felt as though it was going on for. In the interest of full transparency, I have to admit that I did enjoy this season, this arc quite a bit. Or at least for the most part, so I can totally understand why there are some people out there that felt that it went on a little bit too long. For many people, it really was just fight after fight after fight, with very little in terms of substance to really push the overall narrative, save for stuff towards the end of it where we had Midoriya discovering more of the secrets to do with his quirk, and as well as unlocking this new ability that he had. Aside from that stuff, it was just, for the most part, lots of fights, lots of very interesting and spectacular fights, but you know, a lot of fights nonetheless. Of course, from my point of view, I wouldn't say that the arc itself was lacking in substance, far from it. I feel that there was substance within it, and it is that substance that I enjoyed the most about it, more so than the fighting and the whiz-bang pop stuff. This is an arc which was about developing and allowing us to see and get to know more about our extended cast. Characters, many of which we haven't seen in any great detail for well over a season, and in some cases we haven't really seen much of them at all. Maybe we saw a little bit of them during that whole mini tournament arc thing a few seasons back, but even then they didn't really do much. We didn't know what their quirks were, we didn't know what their abilities were, they were just kind of there in the background, looking neat but not really doing much else. And this arc itself was allowing us to get to know these characters a lot more, getting to know the cast from Class B, whom, again, for the most part, they've just kind of been there. We haven't really known what their powers are, and this was an opportunity for us to learn what those powers were, and again, get to know whom they are as people. This is all part of a process that I'll discuss in a little bit more detail when we get to the next arc, but I have to admit that getting to know these characters was probably the thing that made this particular arc work. Without it, I would probably be more in the camp of the people saying that, yeah, this isn't good enough and really needed something that had a little bit more weight and heft to it. But for me, it worked because we were learning about these characters. Again, I must admit that I didn't love all of it. I am slightly in the camp that feels that it went on a little bit too long, and I really am disappointed at just how rushed it felt towards the end of it. Those final 3 episodes just flew by, and it wasn't because they were that engaging, it was just because there wasn't much else going on. We didn't really get to know more about these other characters in quite the same way as we had done up until that point. The episode with Bakugo was just such a curb stomp that these characters didn't really last long enough for us to really get to know them, even get to know what their names were. And naturally, when we had the stuff with Midoriya's fight, it was mostly all about him and discovering more about One for All. So I understand that the extra characters weren't as much in focus in that moment, but to get really nothing from them aside from the crazy quirk stealing fella didn't really feel good enough to me, and it just passed so quickly that it didn't feel as though it should be as engaged as it really should have been. The closest thing in that final episode was the moment when the quirk stealing guy got locked up and he was reflecting on the fact that he was effectively playing the villain and about his role within all of this, and that was interesting for the brief 10 seconds or so it was on screen. But as a whole entity, the arc itself was fun, certainly fun, with some fantastic animation therein, but towards the end of it, it was a little bit too rushed for me to say this was worth it. I'm not going to say it's something that you should skip if you were to go back to it, but it is something where I can understand people just being kind of a little bit there like, yeah, can we move on now? Can we get back to the story here, because this feels like padding. Again, I liked it, I understand why people didn't. Next, we are talking about the Meta Liberation Army stuff. And I also believe that this is also mixed in with from looking at the wiki, the Endeavour agency arc stuff too. It seems to me we have 2 arcs going on at the once now, which is something that's really difficult for me to fully comprehend, but I'm going to try and tackle them both, starting out with the Meta Liberation Army stuff. And I'll put my hands up and admit that I feel that it's a little bit too early to really be giving much of an analysis on it at this point, because from what we have so far, it really feels like the Meta Liberation stuff is material that won't be fully resolved or fully developed until well into next season, possibly not until midway through it, and that the main focus right now has been that Endeavour agency relationship stuff. What we have at the moment as far as the Meta Liberation Army stuff shows a great deal of promise, though it does feel as though the writers are being incredibly coy with what's going on at the moment, and it's something that I have expressed dissatisfaction of many times thus far in this particular season for it. Yes, again, this is stuff that probably will not be fully resolved until next season, but at this point it's just feeling way too vague. We don't really know who our villains are. We don't even know what their names are at this point. Maybe it was mentioned briefly in some of the little interactions, but then you don't really have a face to put to the name. They're all just stood in the shadows, just looking sinister and that's kind of it. We know that the worker with Toba is goons, but again, that's kind of it. And as far as the overall goals are, again, we don't know much about it. Seemingly they just want to spread chaos, but chaos in a fancy $30,000 suit, and that's kind of it. What do they really want for this world? It seems to be, from what I can remember, that they want a world that doesn't need superheroes. Okay, but why, and what are you going to do to make that? Do they sincerely believe in this mantra, this manifesto that they've been handing out and printing out? Or is it just something that this group can use to some kind of sinister end, some kind of major, I don't know, deregulation plot that allows them to set up private superhero companies, or just so they can invest in real estate? I really don't know. I'm just sat here thinking to myself, what do these guys want? Now, I understand why they're being vague about it, because like I say, I feel that this is something we're probably not going to know fully until well into next season, and because of the way that it's being presented to us is almost in real time with Hawks. The more Hawks learns about it, the more we learn about it, which is a neat thing. It prevents us being in a situation where we as an audience know more than the cast, which is something that writers should always do their best to avoid, because again, much like with the joint training stuff, it just leaves you as an audience member just there like, okay, can they find out about this now? Can they learn about this now? They should be learning about this now because we know about it, and they should know about it now because now it's just getting frustrating. So I understand the way that they're going about it. It just feels like we need a little something here. The fact we don't know much beyond vague details just is rather, I wouldn't say infuriating, because I don't think getting furious about a TV show is really worth it, at least not at the age that I am now, but it does feel as though it's kind of a vague threat at the moment. It's this vague threat of villainy that isn't really as interesting as when it's something that's a little bit more quantifiable and comprehensible. It's not as interesting villainy as with Overhaul. It's not even as interesting villainy as with Gentle Criminal, because at least you knew what their ends were. At the moment, it's still very, very up in the air. Now, thankfully, during this whole season, we had to have something that I do feel is this standout arc, this standout, more substantial moment within it, which is this stuff to do with Endeavour. Now, this is stuff which might get resolved, at least this part of it, by the time we get to the end of the season, or much like the Meta Liberation stuff, it might be continuing on until next season, but here and now, it's this spectacularly well-made, some really serious, well-paced character drama, which is really dealing with a difficult subject matter in a very mature and thoughtful way. One which allows us to understand what makes him and his family tick, to understand the trauma and the difficulties that they are going through in a way which feels believable, even if we ourselves cannot physically relate to it, because we have not gone through this kind of stuff that they have. Of course, the reason why we're having all this character building stuff in this arc with Endeavour and Shoto and their family, and why we had it with the joint training stuff in the previous arc. It's because it's all there to help set the emotional stakes as high as possible. As is the case with any piece of fiction, be that superhero related or not, it doesn't matter how high the stakes are, as that alone isn't going to make you care what happens to these characters. It doesn't matter if our villain is going to steal a diamond that's going to make them the richest person in the world, or if our villain is going to shut down the local youth centre to build a golf course so our heroes have to put on a show to raise money to save it, or if there's some kind of evil overlord that's going to blow up everything and take over the universe. It doesn't matter how high these stakes are, because if we don't care about our characters who are fighting these threats, it just comes across as a wholly empty experience. Whilst the joint training arc stuff and the Endeavour stuff isn't showing our villains plotting their schemes and getting their evil machinations into going, it is making us care about the characters who will get involved in all of this, not just within this arc that we're talking about, but future ones coming along down the way. But how many times have you seen a family movie or an adventure movie where a character goes over a cliff and we think that they're dead? And how many times have you seen that moment and just felt next to nothing because you're not really invested in the character? Just by virtue of being a hero doesn't make you care about those characters, doesn't make them command your sympathy, or mean that you have to care about them when something bad happens to them, when they have that moment where they believe all hope is lost. This season so far is about building that investment so that when the bad stuff does happen, when we have these moments where we do feel like all hope is lost, we genuinely feel it alongside these characters, so that when these gut punch moments come along, we really do feel it. And whilst this season thus far isn't quite as spectacular as stuff that we've had previously, that's not really what it's about. It's about developing the emotional stakes within the characters, so again, that inevitably, when things go down the pan, as Midoriya has been hinting they have in some of his narrations, we'll be there shocked and hoping and praying that these characters get through to the other side. Now, of course, for some people, that might not be enough. They might want something that's a little bit more substantial, and I totally get that. And because of where we are in the season, we might still get that. We might well get the moment where we know what our villains want, and we know what their big scheme is. We might have these larger, more grand-scale, set-piece emotional moments, but here and now, it's making us care about people who maybe will be wrapped up in some horrible stuff later on. We'll soon have to see. I won't lie to you, I do wish that there was a little bit more going on in just a ones and zeros sense. We were seeing a little bit more villainy, we were seeing a little bit more about what our Meta Liberation Army peeps were doing, but here and now, when the drama is this good, I'll happily take it. But what about you, dear listener? What do you think about this year's season of My Hero Academia thus far? Have you loved it? Have you hated it? What do you think? Let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll get back to you shortly, either directly in the comments themselves or towards the end of next week's video. In all likelihood, I might well save them for when I actually do my whole season review itself in a few weeks' time. Though when we get that, I don't know, because we have had quite a few weeks recently where there hasn't been an episode, and this is just pushing stuff back a bit. But you know what? We'll soon see about that. Thank you all for listening, and see you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!